Good morning, everybody. Thank you to the organisers for the invite here today. EFPIA, for those of you who are not familiar, is the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations. As a federation, it groups together the national research-based associations, 33 of them from across Europe, and 35 of the multinational corporate members of EFPIA. In addition, we have two specialist groups, the European vaccine manufacturers, of which there are 9 members, and we also have the European biopharmaceutical manufacturers, which is 65 of the smaller biotechnology companies. So it's also been a real education for me here today. It's been fascinating hearing the talks, and as Barbara outlined, I'm an economist. I do not come from the world of clinical research. In fact, I'm not even a health economist, so who booked this guy, you may be asking? I have been involved in industrial policy discussions from kind of both sides of the fence, really. I started off my career working for the European Commission and then the British government, and in the last 6 or 7 years I've been working in the pharmaceutical industry, and now working for EFPIA, I'm involved in some of the discussions with authorities around Europe and the European Union around reconciling the sometimes competing objectives between, on the one hand, the management and control of pharmaceutical budgets, and on the other, trying to maximize the economic potential of what is one of Europe's only really highly knowledge-intensive, R&D-intensive industries in pharmaceuticals. And it's with that in mind that clinical trials become incredibly important. So I wanted to spend one slide just trying to say how important clinical trials are. Well, we all want economic growth in Europe, and for the non-economists in the room, I guess you're mostly non-economists, there are only really 3 ways of growing any economy. You can increase the size of your population or make it more productive. Well, we all know the story about demographic change and the challenges that poses. By the way, making a population more productive, investing in healthcare is a pretty good starting point because you can keep people in the workplace. Second route is to increase capital, and unfortunately there's not very much of that around at the moment, although of course we hope that will increase in future years. Critically, and finally, it's innovation and investing in new technologies and doing things smarter right across the economy. And it's with that in mind that supporting R&D intensive sectors has been a key priority of European policymakers for many years. Sorry, there are 2 gadgets here. I'm trying to pick the right one. Oh, some of my slide has disappeared, unfortunately. So R&D has been important for the European Union, and for a number of years now, the European Union has had an aspiration of spending 3% of GDP on research and development, and we have been well short of that target for some time. It remains an aspiration because it's still important. What you should see here at the bottom of the slide, and unfortunately they've disappeared, are 2 charts that really shine a light on clinical trials. Because of all the private sector R&D done in the whole of the European Union, 20% of it is done by the pharmaceutical sector. And within the pharmaceutical sector, over 50% is in clinical trials. So it's a very short step between saying you need R&D to make Europe grow and you need clinical trials. So it's incredibly important. There we go. There's the charts. Sorry. But the trends in Europe are not going in our favour. The number of clinical trials in the European Union has declined in recent years, and the global marketplace for clinical trials has become ever more competitive. And so it's important that we think and appreciate fully the focus of this conference on ensuring that Greece is an attractive environment for pharmaceuticals, but in many ways, getting to first base is making sure within a global context that Europe is still seen as the right place for companies to operate. Very important, I think, to mention some of the significant changes on the scientific side, which you'll all know extremely well. The importance of personalized medicines the fact that we're looking at companion diagnostics, not just drugs these days, orphan drugs, really present a number of new challenges, I think, to your community in terms of novel trial designs and new challenges. It's important, therefore, that the legislative and regulatory environment can keep pace with those changes. So back to the Commission proposal that has been discussed earlier. Well, to just give you where the perspective on where the industry has been coming from, we've been, for a number of years, putting forward a consistent message on a number of issues. One, first and foremost, is making sure that patients get access to therapeutic breakthroughs without administrative delay, and I'll come back to that at the end of the presentation because it's a critical point. It's also important in a highly diverse Europe that we try to harmonise as much as possible. You can't harmonise everything, but certainly streamlining and harmonising the clinical trial environment throughout the European Union has been an important ask for us. The scientific developments that I just mentioned need to be recognised by those that are designing policy. And really, the horizon of policymakers in clinical trial regulation really needs to be the next decade or two. It mustn't be a quick fix. We must be looking to the future. And I think basically FPA's response, if you will, to the proposals that have been made thus far is that it's a pretty good start. I think many of the points that we've been making in recent years have been listened to. There is, under the proposals, a reduction in some of the differences between member states in terms of process and regulation. Our requests to address issues around timelines seem to have been taken seriously, and in many ways there's more predictability, or there should be more predictability if these proposals go through from an investment standpoint. But will they result in more investment? Well, that's a slightly different question, and I think there are 3 points that I'd like to make in the presentation to just ensure we continue to reflect as the proposals go through the Parliament, through the Council, and get adopted and ultimately implemented. First thing, of course, is that anything involving Brussels and the European Union works at a kind of glacial pace. It may take several years to adopt and certainly to implement the legislation, so it's really important to get things right as quickly as possible. First observation from an investment decision point of view, of course, is around the ethics committee process, which is an incredibly important part, and for very clear reasons. I think the ethical committee process remains at the national level within the European framework, and that is something that I think needs greater reflection in terms of how we can make a very diverse landscape on the ethical front work as efficiently as possible whilst retaining the core objectives around patient safety. I think in other areas of policy, even within healthcare, there are some interesting precedents within the European Union. In health technology assessment, for example, I think there's been some relatively successful experiments with European policymakers creating platforms for exchange and dialogue between national authorities. EU Net HTA, or UNETA, regroups some of the HTA bodies, for example, and I think that's seen as a pretty good platform for sort of enhanced cooperation. And that's the sort of enhanced cooperation we'd like to see in the ethical committee area. So a bit of a tongue-in-cheek play on words there, but maybe now is the time for UNethics alongside UNHTA to create that sort of platform for dialogue. Like I said earlier, I think it is a real concern to us to make sure that when putting in stone new regulation, it is with an eye to the sort of flexibility required to deal with novel research design and issues going forward. And I think there needs to be a bit more dialogue on that to make sure that possible new cutting-edge techniques are going to be permissible in the new framework. Timelines are critical, and here just given a snapshot of approval times. The orange timelines to the right, I think I'm right in saying, do not include this kind of ethical assessment processes. But here you just get a sense of where the new proposal is compared to the old. And this is why, certainly we're quite keen on the new proposals in this respect. Previously, the European regulation stipulated a 30-day kind of deadline for clinical trial approvals, but that didn't include the national processes around ethical committees. New proposals extend the deadline somewhat, but there is an understanding there that it needs to be the whole process, including ethical review. And that really is a very critical thing for us. It improves predictability, and I think as these proposals go through the various debates and legislative hurdles, it's really important to make sure that those clinical trial deadlines or aspirations put forward by the European Commission are adhered to. So I do want to come back to this slide, and it's been mentioned in a couple of presentations thus far. I've deliberately put up a chart here of a wide range of countries because I certainly don't want to single out Greece. But there is, frankly, an access crisis in Europe right now. This chart shows two elements of access crisis. One is on the availability of new medicines on the market, and there you see a real disparity across European countries in terms of availability of medicines. It also shows the level of sales of those available medicines, and that's another layer of inequality. So even if you have approval, even if you have a medicine on the market, there is inequality in terms of the extent to which those medicines are used. It's a really critical basic point. If patients don't get access to the gold standard of care, then companies simply won't be able to invest in clinical trials in that country. And that's something we always have to put forward as a core kind of observation for the European Union as a whole. So in conclusion then, I think we have a really good opportunity right now. I think the revision process is the right one for reflecting on how attractive the European Union is as a whole for pharmaceutical research and development, and we need to keep that long-term horizon of at least the next couple of decades in mind. Would really like to see some creative thinking about how the ethical committee process across the European Union, whilst respecting national kind of priorities, can be made as efficient as possible, and possibly through some kind of enhanced cooperation network, there may be some possible ways forward there. Really important to keep the Commission's timelines not diluted through the various legislative hoops that they'll have to go through. And then finally, of course, whatever changes are made to the clinical trial regulatory and legal framework, I think we have to see those as a necessary but not a sufficient condition for attracting further investment into Europe in the future. And there, the market side, fixing the market, making sure that we, including in an environment of austerity, we think creatively about how to make sure the European patients get access to the best standard of care, because that will be the most powerful platform for attracting further investment. Thanks very much.